I don't really know. I mean, I said I just feel grateful, really, about where I'm from. And I would like anyone who wants to be part of it to share in that gratitude. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why I'm so amazed that the other tone has become the normal tone. The thing of, I haven't been given enough. Other people have kept stuff from me. I'm of this minority, whether it's sexual, racial, whatever, and I'm owed something by somebody else. Powerful people are holding me down. If I could just squeeze them and then drink whatever it is that's produced when you squeeze them, we could all kind of come out exactly the same. Screw that. It's a hideous idea that's being pushed onto this, I think, particularly the younger generation on this. But as I say, it starts in some way with this fundamental thing of what is the attitude you have to the society and the culture which you're from, that have been on my mind recently. The Guardian, a well-known comic in the UK. The Guardian ran a piece a few months ago about cycling deaths on the roads in the UK. Okay? What's the title of the piece? Why roads designed by men are killing women. Seriously. It's like, you've got to bring the sexist war into cycling deaths. Piece in the New York Times, November 2017, by a black contributor to the New York Times, who writes a piece with the headline, "Should I allow my children to play with white children?" I'll give you, a few weeks ago in the BBC, front page website, is a story about a young girl who's black, mixed race, who's been offered a place at Cambridge, and the piece is, "I've been offered a place at Cambridge, but I don't know if I should accept it because I'm black." And you go, why the hell wouldn't you? Has Cambridge become some racist hellhole since I last went there?
The discussion begins with Yaron Brook, who talks about the revelations of Western Europe and its advancements. This development began all the way back in the 18th century, with the Greeks devising various ideas that elevated Western Europe as a whole. Yaron Brook discusses the ascent of Western civilization during this time, considered one of the most important periods in the history of Western Europe and the beginning of their civilization.
All of European history, I don't think it's all European countries. I certainly don't think it's spread out equally across Europe. I think it's particular places at particular times influenced by particular ideas. And I think the ideas that dominate what we think of as Western civilization are the ideas of the Enlightenment. The ideas primarily of the 18th century that came about primarily in England and Scotland and in France and in other European centers of thought. Of course, those ideas were developed and established on the basis of discoveries and ideas and aesthetics of the Renaissance. So it has a tradition that goes back, but I think it coalesced around a particular civilization that we recognize today as Western during the Enlightenment. And there were two fundamental ideas that I think represent Western civilization and differentiate it, both from the past in terms of what Europe was like, or this particular geographic area, and from the rest of the world during the period of the ascent of Western civilization. And those two ideas are reason, the efficacy of reason, the primacy of reason, reason as the means of attaining knowledge. What was the way to attain knowledge before this idea that reason is the means to do it? Where does knowledge come from, if not for reason? Well, for centuries, it was by means of some form of revelation, whether we each practiced that revelation independently as individuals, or whether we had a pope figure that practiced the revelation himself, or whether there was some other form of philosopher king that discovered the truth and conveyed it to us. We as individuals were not expected to think for ourselves, we're not expected to have the capacity to know the world for ourselves. But that all changes somewhere around 1700. That changes with the scientific revolution. Suddenly, there are scientists out there explaining the world to us in ways that we can all understand. Suddenly, there are things that everybody can pretty much figure out. We don't need revelation. We don't need a philosopher king to tell us why things act. We actually have a scientific method that we can use to discover these things. And I think, in that sense, Newton is as part of the Enlightenment as is John Locke, as are the great philosophers. The scientific revolution cannot be separated from the political revolution that is happening at that time. It's all about the discovery of the efficacy of this tool, this amazing tool that we have. And if you look at other cultures in the world, if you look at other civilizations in the world, it just doesn't happen over there. It doesn't happen in China. There's never this respect for the human mind, and there's never this discovery of a method for using the mind. If you look at India, if you look at South America, if you look at any civilization, the one thing they're always missing is this idea that we have a conceptual mind that is capable of knowing the world, and there's a method to its use. That's, I think, the differentiating factor between what becomes Western civilization and the rest of the world. And of course, that idea comes from the Greeks. That idea comes primarily from Aristotle. That idea comes from a Greek philosophical tradition that then is rediscovered by Thomas Aquinas and kind of integrated into the Catholic Church and really manifests itself and flourishes during the Enlightenment. Of course, the second idea is the implication of the first. If we all have the capacity to think for ourselves and discover truth about the world for ourselves, then why can't we decide who to work for or what profession to have? Right? Before that, you couldn't. Why can't we decide who to marry? That didn't exist before like the 18th, 19th century. And in some parts of the world to this day, it doesn't exist. Why can't we decide who our leaders should be and what kind of life we should live and how to engage in that life? If we have this capacity to reason, why can't we apply it on our own values, on our own decisions? And that's the idea of individualism, the sanctity of the individual. The individual is no longer a tool to be sacrificed for the group, the collective. I think the best political manifestation for this in written form is the Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration of Independence, which is a core part of what I consider Western civilization. All of those ideas, the idea of the efficacy of reason, the idea of individualism, are today challenged within what we consider the West, and have, of course, been challenged for generations outside of what we consider the West by thinkers everywhere else around the world.
The ascent of Western civilization during this time saw significant advancements in science, philosophy, economics, and political thought. Key developments included the rise of humanism, the scientific revolution, the spread of capitalism, and the development of democratic institutions. This period laid the foundation for the modern world, with Western ideas and institutions becoming dominant on a global scale.
I think it's under assault. And yet, I think there are few thinkers in the West who understand what Western civilization is. There are few people who really comprehend it and are therefore willing to fight for its preservation. And as a consequence, those philosophies, those ideas that are anti the ideas of individualism and reason and everything that implies, I think it implies capitalism, it implies freedom, political freedom. Those ideas are withering away as the offensive from alternative ideas intensify and those who stand for those ideas become a smaller and smaller minority. That's the pessimist side. That's the idea that it is indeed dying. I'll just end with one positive, right? The positive is that for the first time in history, Western ideas are not the exclusive monopoly of the West. That is, today, ideas are available to everybody at any time, anywhere in the world. The renaissance of capitalism and freedom and these ideas might not be in Europe or the United States. It might be in Asia, it might be in Africa, it might be somewhere else, because the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of Aristotle, the art, the expression of those ideas in aesthetics is now available to everybody. And since these ideas, I believe, are universal, they're not connected to a history or to a skin color or to an ethnicity, but are truly universal, these ideas could manifest themselves anywhere in the world, and to some extent already have, to the extent that Asia has been successful. They have taken the ideas to some extent seriously. The idea of science and reason and individualism. When you go to China, if you go to Shanghai, it's not your vision of collectivism. They build whatever skyscrapers they want, and they're all interesting and original. And the people walking the street are dressed individualistically and yelling at one another as only individualists can yell at one another. Collectivists don't yell at one another. They just, it's a vibrant place, and that might be changing. But my point is that Western civilization, its core elements are being exported to the rest of the world. And I don't think the genie can be put back in the bottle. I don't think that can be sucked out. So even as Western Europe is under threat, even as the United States in many respects is under threat, the ideas are surviving and thriving elsewhere, and I think will survive and will thrive. And in that sense, Western civilization will not die. It will just express itself differently, maybe in a different place. Hopefully not, hopefully still here. But it will express itself differently one day. Thank you.
He emphasizes that although Western Europe and the US are currently perceived to be under some threat, they are expected to flourish as they should soon. Before we move on to the next part, here are some points on why Western Europe is considered to be under potential threat at present. This situation arises from several factors, including economic challenges, demographic shifts, and political instability. The rise of populism, nationalism, and identity politics has also created divisions within societies, undermining the values of liberal democracy. According to Yaron Brook, these factors have substantially deteriorated Western Europe. Let us now explore Douglas Murray's perspective on the current protracted decline of Western civilization.
Consequence, and I just pick up on one thing you finished with that. I agree myself that elements of Western civilization are visibly able to be transplanted in other parts of the world. Right, China, capitalism, individualism, not freedom, of course, which is an important one to miss out for them. I was very struck recently by an interview with a French philosopher, Alan Finkielkraut, where he said something I thought very, very profound. Where he said that he was specifically speaking about France, but I think what he said could be said almost in any Western European country. He said that we had a period in our history, he said, where we thought that our values should be transported around the world. And that slowly diminished, and then we got to a point where we thought, well, maybe our values are for these people, not for those maybe. And he said, and now in the 21st century, we're in this situation where we're wondering, can we at least still have them for ourselves? It's a very profound observation, and I think there's what I describe as a certain modern European pessimism that comes from that feeling. Maybe we could still keep it for ourselves. This whole question has an us and them component. People hate us and them arguments. It's very reductive, but every attempt to sum up things this complex is going to be reductive at some point. The them bit of what I've been discussing and writing about in recent years is the bit that, in my experience, people are most interested in. It is the fact that we have been going through a very interesting process in Europe with the era of mass migration. Not migration, but mass migration, where we are going through an experiment to see whether or not our values are, in very, very short spaces of time, able to be transmitted swiftly to people with totally different value systems. And it's an experiment. We've decided to do an experiment on the only petri dish we have. It's like deciding to do an experiment for an amazing new idea you've had and injecting it into your only child before doing any tests at all. Yeah. But there we go. This attempt to see whether or not we can transmit all of our values, learning and culture very fast to everybody who's come here is a work in progress. But that first thing, the as it were, the them bit, is the first component of this. Just the simple fact, and some people loathe this, some people love it, and most of us have very mixed feelings about it. But the fact that that mass movement of peoples has happened in Europe since the 1950s has very significantly changed Europe, has had all sorts of consequences, some for the good, some not for the good. And we are picking our way through that. But it has had a profound and, I think, undeniable impact. But the second part, the bit that I find people are far less interested in talking about, but I'm actually much more interested in talking about in a way, is the us bit. The strange thing of, why would anyone do this to themselves? Why would anyone go through this? What would cause you to do something which in historical terms is pretty unnatural, or at least uncommon, to very fundamentally change your society in this particular manner? Now, the us bit, I think, is particularly interesting because, again, we're in the middle of it. And there's no way of knowing how it turns out. But my own view is that the substructure of Western civilization has been eroding for a long, long time now. I go into some of the specifics in the book. It's been happening in the realm of religion, very obviously. And again, you can like that or loathe it, but most of us have very mixed views about it. But I think it's undeniable, the slow withdrawing raw. And it's been happening in the realm of culture and mind. But my own view is that this leaves us in this very complex position where we're wondering, as Finkelkraut said, we're wondering if we can hold on to the bits that we still have. Now, my own suggestion is that there is something else going on at the moment. I've been writing about this more recently for the forthcoming book, is that there is an attempt to basically embed a new form of metaphysics in our societies, to try to rethink the whole thing, to say, well, look, we're in such a mess with our past, we're in such a mess with what we've had, that let's try to sort of start again. Let's revivify something. Let's set new ground rules, what the new morality is, what the new interpretation of the West is. And I think that is in itself, again, a fascinating and terrible experiment that's beginning. My own view is that could we at least keep it for ourselves, is not an unvalid question, and not a question that should be replied to with the mockery, which it is, I think, generally replied to with. What we have had in Europe, and what we still have, is not nothing, and historically is very rare. And I am constantly amazed by the mistaken idea that we have, what you have in Sweden, is the default position of mankind. That it's what happens whenever you throw people down, congregate, organize.
Douglas Murray precisely identifies why Western civilization is eventually deteriorating. The root cause of this intractable issue is mass immigration, which has been occurring since the 1950s and has significantly increased over time. Additional factors include a gradual shift away from traditional values and heritage, economic stagnation, increased debt, rising inequality, and growing political polarization and instability within Western democracies. These elements are seen as contributing to the unfortunate decline of Western civilization.
And I think this presumption is so wildly misguided that one of the most important things that we have to do is to keep saying to the people who have these presumptions, to lay out, first of all, why they think as they do, in the face of extraordinarily strong evidence to the contrary. And secondly, to the people trying to embed this new kind of metaphysics we're getting into, a new type of religion. The people who speak about this civilization, this country, my country, this continent, who speak about it only in terms of grudge, of vengeance, of vendetta, never in the spirit of forgiveness or love or gratitude. I've always said this about my own views about what some people call nationalism or patriotism. Somebody said to me some years ago, you patriotic, and I said, find it's a strange question to be asked. I said, I don't really know. I mean, I said, I just feel grateful, really, about where I'm from. And I would like anyone who wants to be part of it to share in that gratitude. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why I'm so amazed that the other tone has become the normal tone. The thing of, I haven't been given enough. Other people have kept stuff from me. I'm of this minority, whether it's sexual, racial, whatever, and I'm owed something by somebody else. Powerful people are holding me down. If I could just squeeze them and then drink whatever it is that's produced when you squeeze them, we could all kind of come out exactly the same. Screw that. It's a hideous idea that's being pushed onto this, I think, particularly younger generation on this. But as I say, it starts in some way with this fundamental thing of what is the attitude you have to the society and the culture which you're from? Is it, broadly speaking, one of this place has been a place of oppression, of racism, of sexism, of inequality, and on and on and on, compared to what? We never get told, but is it that, or is it, broadly speaking, to say, this has been an extraordinary ride so far, and I'd like to see it continue. I know which one I feel, but I know which one is being taught to a new generation as well. Anyhow, with that I hand over to you.
Douglas Murray highlights how many people are not proud of their heritage and often fail to give it the recognition it deserves, which is one reason why Western civilization has been deeply affected. He also addresses a new philosophical thinking called the new metaphysics. For those who don't know, this is an idea influenced by postmodernism that allegedly challenges traditional notions of objective reality, truth, and meaning. This has led to a focus on the subjective, fragmented, and relativistic nature of human experience. Douglas Murray points out how this new framework for society seems utterly unnecessary, and I fully endorse his viewpoint on this matter.
Discuss anything of consequence with a politician, and you have a truth, and they don't, which does happen. You always find the politician will do the following move on you. They'll say, I guess I'm just more optimistic than Douglas. It's a constant trick, this one. Well, I guess I'm just more optimistic than you, yeah. As if like, the most optimistic person in any situation wins. I mean, there's all sorts of times it's very unwise to be optimistic. Very unwise to be standing at a bus stop and the bus has not come along for hours and hours and hours. It's very unwise to be optimistic that it will at some point quite soon, so stay there another day. It's a strange thing that's built into almost all discussion lists. Pessimism, Roger Scruton, a great philosopher from the UK, wrote a book some years ago called The Uses of Pessimism. And it's a very, very interesting book. And I have to say, as a default position, to be pessimistic also has its downsides, also is unwise in situations. So just all of these attitudes, in a way, we have to go beyond just, if the facts look good, you'll be positive about it. If they look bad, don't be. Address them. And as I say, I'm amazed by the attitude of politics and of indeed of philosophy as well. I think there are all sorts of things which it's worth being pessimistic about in order, among other things, to warn yourself and to warn others. I mentioned earlier, I think that carrying out great experiments on a society and making the stakes this high is an unwise thing and would have been restrained if people had been more pessimistic. I mentioned this on the radio program earlier, that to do some of the things that we've done in recent decades, and to say, well, if it will come out right. It has to come out right. It must come out right. Well, everything has the other opportunity as well. What if it goes wrong? What if this great experiment fails? What then? As I say, you've done an enormous experiment, the most lethal experiment imaginable, and it might not work. I think that a good dose of pessimism might have helped earlier on this. This is very complex stuff. It's not a science. Nobody knows how to do it. I've noticed this for years in an area I've written about a lot and studied a lot, the so-called radicalization, which is one of the ways that people make a science out of something that isn't a science. There's always 7 steps to de-radicalization, 8 steps to radicalization, 9 ways to make it up. The 3 Ps, the 4 Rs, they always come up with things like this. Nobody knows. It's not a science. It's a social science. Maybe. Maybe. Not a science. And it's always presented as if it is. And as I say, I think maybe not pessimism, deep, deep skepticism about some of the things that have been going on, I think is a very wise attitude. And by the way, also conceding when pessimists are wrong. I mean, it's not like, again, this is the thing to do with the attitude. It's not like one wants to be pessimistic and it's just much more fun. In fact, I had an example recently, slight divergence, but if I may give an example of this, it's been on my mind recently. I haven't written about it yet, but I'm planning to. A very, very interesting thing happened. We're about to come up to the 30th anniversary of the fatwa issued against Salman Rushdie for writing the Satanic Verses, which in my country, anyway, was a very, very important moment, and I think was globally.
Murray talks about how sceptical he is about these new extensive changes the government imposes on the country. He argues that such changes can disrupt societal cohesion and lead to unintended negative consequences. He expresses concern that new government policies, often driven by progressive ideologies, may impose unrealistic or divisive ideas on society. Murray believes that these policies can undermine established norms and create unnecessary conflict. Maybe embracing a dose of pessimism regarding these experiments should be encouraged to ensure a better future after all.
It has happened of much, much less import recently, but which struck me very deeply when it occurred. And pardon me going from the sublime to the possibly ridiculous, but not all of you will be familiar with the work of a pop band called One Direction. I mean, obviously you all know the early work, but this is a pop band. They're very amiable, 5 young guys who won a television show in the UK. I'll make this short. They run a television show in the UK, and they formed a pop band, and they millions and millions of records, fans all around the world. And it was a nice representation of on Britain. One, nice-looking young guys. One of them was Irish, and one of them was of Pakistani Muslim descent, Zayn Malik. And I mention this because some years ago he was in Istanbul and he sent out a tweet about, there's only one God, Allah, and so on. I remember noticing at the time, I thought, well, that's interesting. A few weeks ago, he gave an interview, this young guy, to a magazine somewhere, and they asked him about his religion, and he said, I don't consider myself a Muslim anymore, I'm not religious anymore. And the reason I mention this is just because nothing happened. Nothing happened. It was the dog that didn't bark in the Sherlock Holmes story. And I found that absolutely fascinating. So, and the reason I mention this is because if you're very pessimistic about immigration and so on, like I, to some extent, am, that's the sort of thing you wouldn't expect to happen. You would expect front-page stories, Imam issues death sentence on Zayn Malik of One Direction for leaving Islam. Zayn Malik chased into hiding. The point is, I'm saying, is that there's stuff like that going on which is very, very hard to quantify. And I'm not saying by any means I think the solution to integration, or what I write about in my last book, is Zayn Malik. Very important. Don't get that as a takeaway. But that isn't nothing, because that means that within a generation, it may have become not completely safe, but a lot safer, that actual freedom to move within religions and out of religions might be happening. So I give this somewhat long-winded and esoteric example, just to make that point, that when evidence comes up that may be against something else, it's nevertheless very, very well worth paying attention to it.
What is your take on this one?
But I am, right? And I am trying to assess the facts. And I'm not an optimist about a lot of what we're discussing today. So I will get to this more pessimistic view of Europe, which I think is mostly right. I am an optimist, and I'm an optimist basically for similar reasons as I guess Steven Pinker is. You know, I look at the world around, and it looks pretty good. And yes, China is not free, and I wish it was, and it's heading towards less freedom, if anything. But given where they are, 40 years ago, I couldn't even imagine them one day being free, because Mao Zedong was just, his authoritarianism was all-encompassing. You couldn't imagine China would ever evolve from that. Today, I can imagine a China that's free one day. Not tomorrow, maybe not in 10 years, maybe not in 20 years, but one day. I don't see that value of freedom as anymore being linked only with Western civilization. I do think it is a global value, that it will take time. It didn't happen in the West without a lot of bloodshed and without a lot of fighting and a lot of intellectuals advocating for it. And I think it can happen elsewhere. And I think the long-term trajectory is that it does happen in many of these countries, because I think in the end, truth works. And going back to what Douglas said about these values, I still believe that Western values are universal. Universal. They apply to every human being on the planet. They don't know it yet. Right? And in that sense, maybe, I'm a chauvinist or whatever you call. I believe that everybody benefits when they adopt kind of the values that we associate with Western civilization. It makes them richer, it makes them freer, and it makes them happier, and it makes them spiritually, better, because Western arts is better. It just is better. So I think that these values are universal, and that they will ultimately, because they are right, have an impact around the world. And to go back to my this idea of suicide, there's no question that part of what is killing the West is people coming in, and let's call it Muslims coming in, right? You're not allowed to say that in Sweden, I know, but it's Islam that is in this case, because I don't. And we might disagree on this or might not, but I don't think that threat exists in the United States. I don't think that immigration in the United States has the same impact as immigration has in Europe, partially because it's not mass migration at the same levels as it is here, but partially because I think different people with different ideas are coming in there than are in Europe. I think Islam plays a big role here in making it a threat. But I think the reason, first of all, you're running the experiment, but particularly with mass migration rather than normal migration. And the reason this experiment will probably fail is because of the rot that already existed in Western civilization to begin with. That it is the rot that makes it possible. This is often, what caused the Roman Empire to fall? The barbarians. Well, yeah, kind of, but it was rotten already inside. That is a confident, strong Rome of 200 years or 300 years earlier would have stood up to the barbarians and beaten them back and defeated them. It wouldn't have been an issue.
Yaron Brook argues that Western civilization is unique in its dedication to promoting and protecting human rights, freedom of speech, and other values that contribute to a better quality of life. He contends that these principles are universally applicable and can improve the lives of everyone on the planet.
And I think in this case, a strong West that understands the values and understands that they're universal and is willing to, in a sense, preach them, not literally preach them, but live them and expect others to live them. I think the external threat might still be there. The experiment might still be dangerous, but it would be much less dangerous.
Brook argues that Western values and institutions have had a positive influence on other parts of the world, contributing to the spread of democratic governance, economic development, and social progress.
What is, in today, postmodernism, the idea that there is no truth, that there is no reality, that there is no set of values that are actually universal and good for human beings. That rot is partially what Douglas described in terms of this idea that we are determined by our genes, and particular genes, because we have different genes, so it's, we're different because of our sexual orientation or because of our particular gender. I guess they're now 32 or 98, so I lose track. Nobody really knows. Yeah, it changes by the minute. Your values are determined primarily by the skin color or by your nationality, which is very, very strong in Europe, rather than by your humanity, by your individualism, and by the use of your reason to discover those values. I think so. I think that postmodern leftist, that rot has been eating away at Western civilization since the last thing that ate away at Western civilization, which was communism and fascism, right? These are also, my world, communism and fascism are anti-Western. They're not part of Western civilization. They're the negation of Western civilization. It's the anti-West rising up to try to defeat the Enlightenment and what the West actually represents. And I think those forces still exist in our culture in new forms. I've criticized the left, so let's criticize the right. On the right, it's nationalism. Nationalism not as that kind of positive view of I was born in a good place and I'm grateful to having been born. It's this country and flag no matter what, and I will never move, and this is it. Doesn't matter if my country's free or not free. This is where I was born, therefore this is where I die. And that has become even more provincial, so that in America, one of the phenomena you see is people are moving less. One of the beauties of America used to be that if you lost your job in Ohio, you got in your car and you drove to Arkansas and you got a job in Arkansas. And people move constantly, and you can actually measure these things. They're indexes of how often people move. They buy places in different states. People are not moving anymore in the United States. Hell, I was born in Ohio, I will die in Ohio, and I had a steel job, and I expect to have a steel job when I die. Ain't happening, but the expectation is there, right? So we become provincial, tribal, and both, I think this is a phenomena of the right now as a response to the left, but a phenomena of both, which I think is deeply, deeply troubling. And maybe because I'm an immigrant, right? I wasn't born in one place. And actually, I often say my kids are fourth generation born on a different continent. So I'm the classic wandering Jew, right? We wander. My kids were born in America. I was born in Asia. I was born in Israel. My parents were born in South Africa. And their parents were born not far from here in Lithuania. So, and who knows before that. So, my perspective is that mass immigration has happened in the past. And yes, partially it happened from Europe into the United States, and you could say similar cultures, but they weren't that similar. Those Jews from the shtetl coming to New York had no concept of what a modern city looked like, had no concept what a modern life would be, had no concept what education was beyond the education of the Old Testament that they in the cheder, which they sent their kids to. And they showed up in New York, and reality forced them to assimilate, right? I think one of the ills of modern society is we've created a welfare state that doesn't force you to assimilate. We've created a society that says, don't assimilate because we're no better than you. Multiculturalism. I mean, all of these phenomena are part, the welfare state is part of the rot that I think is part of Western civilization. It doesn't just, make it more difficult for people to assimilate, but I think it makes it part of the squeezing of the tube, right? If we have a welfare state, it's a zero-sum game. Somebody's getting something at somebody's expense. What they're getting, I'm not getting. I want it. How come they got it? How come I didn't get it? I have a right. I deserve. Hand it over. It changes the mentality. It changes that mentality again, away from individualism, away from really evaluating reality as it is, but expectations and demands and needs. So I think all of these have been rotting Western civilization. I believe Western civilization would be dying even if we didn't have mass migration. What mass migration is doing is it accelerates it. It's like throwing fuel in a fire. It brings out all the worst elements, and the good elements are not being defended as a.
Brook argues that postmodern leftist ideologies often reject the concept of objective truth, promoting relativism instead. He believes this undermines rational discourse and the search for objective standards in areas such as ethics, politics, and science. He believes that these critiques can erode the foundations of Western civilization by challenging fundamental principles such as individualism and personal responsibility.
Very struck by this in recent years. I was slightly slow on the uptake of exactly what was going on. I think I now get it, that this, what I describe as this attempt to put a new metaphysics into the structure. And what I'm saying is that sort of thing of life as an ongoing, endless battle to assert minority rights, and the weaponization of everything, the politicization of everything. I'll give you a couple of quick examples of that that have been on my mind recently. The Guardian, a well-known comic in the UK. The Guardian ran a piece a few months ago about cycling deaths on the roads in the UK. Okay? What's the title of the piece? Why roads designed by men are killing women. Seriously. It's like, you've got to bring the sexist war into cycling deaths. Piece in the New York Times, November 2017, by a black contributor to the New York Times, who writes a piece with the headline, "Should I allow my children to play with white children?" A few weeks ago in the BBC, front page website, is a story by a young girl who's black, mixed race, who's been offered a place at Cambridge, and the piece is, "I've been offered a place at Cambridge, but I don't know if I should accept it because I'm black." And you go, why the hell wouldn't you? Has Cambridge become some racist hellhole since I last went there? Has it become... my point is, this stuff, which is everywhere now in our culture, the weaponization of women against men, of men against women, of gays against heterosexuals, of heterosexuals against gays, of trans against everyone, and the endless idea that our lives should be used best by being on social media and finding a person who's just objected to something that was agreed upon until kind of yesterday, but didn't read that morning's bulletin and got it wrong, and then can get their life torn asunder. But that's a good use of our time. That's a good use of our time. Now, again, a lot of people think that at the moment. A lot of people think, they will hopefully learn that this is a horrible, horrible way to live, and that when they're on their deathbeds, they will not look back with great pride at their lives and think of the Twitter storms they were part of. Almost certain that will not be something which they look back on as something of meaning. But my point is that it's something to do. And I think I said last time we met, I've been fascinated for a long time by this thing that our society has been for a while now, maybe one of the first societies in human history, have no overriding explanation for what we're meant to be doing here. And a lot of young people I know have this. It's like, maybe at some point somebody's going to stand across my life and explain what it's all about. Now, everyone has had some of that at some point. We've all at some point in our lives felt that. Somebody at some point will stand astride my life and tell me, "Douglas, the point is X." And I'll go, "Oh, thank goodness for that." So we all have, my point is not the urge to have that happen. It's not the question, it's not that. It's the fact that there's no answer. That there's not even an attempt to provide an answer. Which means, as I say, that's why when Yaron mentioned with Islam, that's why I have the worry about Islam, because Islam has a very strong answer. Totally comprehensive answer to everything, from what you should do with a garment if you've peed on it, literally, in the hadith, to the meaning of everything. That's for a lot of people, that's very good stuff to have. You've got the book of meaning. And I think that one of the great challenges that our societies have is to find a way to address that impulse. And all I know in the time being is to also steer people away from this politicization of everything, because it is driving people mad. It's going to drive them a lot madder, and we've got to find a way out of it, because that and the identity politics is what is so dangerous about it.
Douglas Murray points out yet another important issue that has been largely unvoiced, not just in the country, but around the world: the politicization of everything. He argues that this trend is sabotaging societal cohesion, leading to a situation where various groups such as men and women, heterosexuals and homosexuals end up in conflict with one another. What are your opinions on this? What do you think contributes to the decline of Western civilization? Let us know in the comments. If you want to see more of Douglas Murray exposing the reality of various things, be sure to check out our channel and subscribe.